You have been lying to yourself for a very long time. You call it being a good person. The world calls it being an easy target. You were conditioned to smile while people crossed your boundaries and took exactly what was yours. You were trained to actively shrink your physical presence. Did this just so others could feel comfortable breathing in the room. They told you this quiet submission was a virtue. They lied straight to your face. While you were busy bleeding out for people who never even handed you a bandage, the ruthless were building their empires. The weak hand over their energy. The dangerous guard it like gold. In this video, you will learn the exact psychological framework required to entirely dismantle the curse of the agreeable man. You will discover how to rebuild your mind into an untouchable fortress that commands absolute respect without saying a single word. Your entire reality shifts the moment you stop leaking power. Must learn to relentlessly hoard it instead. This knowledge is strictly for self-preservation. It is an intellectual armor engineered to protect you from those who prey on the excessively generous, not a weapon to destroy the innocent. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I am done bleeding for the ungrateful. The first brutal truth. Your niceness is a flashing beacon for predators. You were aggressively taught that being endlessly accommodating would earn you lifelong loyalty and deep respect. Here is the brutal truth. It only earns you chronic exhaustion. Most people falsely believe that constantly sacrificing their own needs makes them deeply valuable to the tribe. But the powerful understand that endless sacrifice simply makes you cheap. Think about someone you know who is always available and always willing to drop everything to help others. Do not truly respect them. You secretly pity them. Every single time you say yes when your instinct violently screams no, you hand over a massive piece of your personal sovereignty. Does not signal high virtue when you avoid necessary conflict at all costs. It signals profound fear. People can smell that fear on you from across the room. They sense instinctively that you are utterly terrified of rejection and abandonment. Machiavelli understood this dark psychological trigger with terrifying clarity. He repeatedly warned that a man who insists on being genuinely good in a world full of ruthless predators will inevitably be completely ruined. Cannot negotiate with a starving tiger by continually offering it more pieces of your own flesh. When you nervously over-explain your personal decisions, you expose your deepest insecurities to the entire room. When you constantly chase external approval, you auction off your inner dignity for a low price nobody is ever actually willing to pay. You must realize right now that the system was never designed to reward your warmth. It was strictly designed to extract every single ounce of utility from your blind compliance. The psychological shift happens when you make a conscious, unwavering decision to become incredibly expensive. You stop handing out unlimited access to your energy as if it were a worthless commodity. People will aggressively test you when you first stop accommodating them. Let them test you. Their immediate frustration is merely proof that they were heavily benefiting from your total lack of boundaries. The second brutal truth. The calculated architecture of the unreadable man. There is a specific man you have watched your entire life without ever truly understanding his nature. You have never quite grasped how he moves so effortlessly through this deeply hostile world. He does not ever beg for attention. He never performs for the fleeting approval of the desperate crowd. He simply walks into a crowded room, and the psychological dynamic immediately shifts in his absolute favor. You have quietly studied him for years, constantly wondered what secret psychological weapon he carried concealed inside his mind. He is not cold because he is fundamentally broken or damaged. He is totally unreadable because he made a deliberate surgical decision to violently seal off all of his emotional leaks. He systematically gathered up his innate empathy and his crippling need for external validation. Then he buried those massive liabilities so deep that no external manipulator could ever possibly reach them. This is not senseless cruelty. This is the highly calculated creation of an absolute psychological fortress. While you were leaking your highly valuable energy into meaningless daily interactions, he was quietly consolidating his unshakable power. Machiavelli firmly believed that relying on the fragile goodwill of others is exactly like building your permanent house on shifting quicksand. The truly untouchable man builds his empire on the solid stone of his own ruthless self-reliance. He knows exactly that emotions displayed carelessly in public are incredibly dangerous liabilities. Every time you show desperate need, you hand your waiting enemy a fully loaded weapon. Every time you need external validation to feel whole, you instantly surrender your total autonomy to a passing stranger. The dangerous man needs absolutely nothing from you or anybody else. That chilling needlessness is a devastating psychological force in any human interaction. It automatically creates an invisible, impenetrable armor that forces people to second-guess themselves before they ever dare to test his resolve. Must actively stop trying to be universally liked and start aggressively striving to be deeply respected. The exact moment you stop needing the room, you completely own the room. Become a sovereign entity that cannot be moved by the desperate emotional currents aggressively swirling around you. Drop this affirmation in the comments. My presence is a privilege. The third brutal truth. Silence is psychological warfare. Most men bleed their power out through their constantly open mouths. They talk way too much. They nervously fill every single quiet void with completely meaningless and desperately insecure chatter. You were taught to immediately justify yourself the second somebody questions your motives. Here is the unfiltered reality. Every extra word you desperately spit out is another brick ripped directly from the protective walls of your personal fortress. The weak constantly explain. The dangerous quietly watch. Imagine being verbally attacked in a highly tense meeting, where everyone violently expects you to desperately defend your fragile ego. The amateur immediately explodes. He launches into a pathetic, rambling defense that strongly reeks of deep internal insecurity and absolute terror. The sovereign man simply stares. He responds with absolute chilling silence until the arrogant attacker slowly drowns in their own rapidly rising panic. Machiavelli understood this devastating dynamic with frightening precision. He saw that the man who fiercely controls the flow of information completely commands the entire human hierarchy. Silence is incredibly heavy. It applies massive, crushing psychological pressure to the fragile nervous systems of the people desperately trying to read your hidden intentions. When you absolutely refuse to give them a single syllable, their anxious minds are forcefully compelled to fill the dark, terrifying blanks. They will construct a monster. They will inevitably construct an image of you that is vastly more terrifying and deeply formidable than your actual everyday reality. That is not accidental manipulation. That is the absolute mastery of raw human perception. Your terrifying lack of emotional reaction forces them to constantly second-guess every single aggressive move they just made against you. You must fiercely guard your chosen words. Treat them exactly like a sovereign king ruthlessly guards his finite gold reserves against thieving mercenaries. Speak rarely. Strike precisely. Let your total lack of nervous chatter make everyone around you intensely curious about the dark machinery quietly operating behind your calm, unreadable eyes. The man who cannot be decoded can never be destroyed. Drop this affirmation in the comments. My silence is a weapon. The fourth brutal truth. Emotional detachment is absolute immunity. Here is the exact fault line where almost every single ambitious man completely shatters. They fail in raw emotion. They let their volatile feelings violently hijack their rational minds at the exact moment when cold calculation matters the absolute most. Uncontrolled emotion is a screaming confession. clearly broadcasts your exact psychological pressure points to every single lurking predator, carefully watching you from the shadows. You were taught to be completely vulnerable, while you were blindly crying for useless sympathy in the cutthroat boardroom. They were ruthlessly plotting to completely consume your entire market share. The man who violently erupts in wild anger instantly hands his clever opponent a detailed, fully labeled map of his deepest hidden vulnerabilities. The man who desperately chases a retreating target telegraphs loudly that he possesses zero inherent value of his own. The wise man rigorously prepares. Machiavelli explicitly warned that the prince must behave strategically in times of peace. Exactly so he is heavily fortified when absolute chaos violently erupts. This is the core principle of deep emotional insulation. It is not about permanently killing off your basic human capacity to actually feel normal things. It is about becoming so massively anchored in your core identity that no external betrayal or catastrophic failure can ever possibly uproot you. Think about the untouchable giants. Think about the most aggressively dominant historical figures who ruthlessly forged massive global empires from absolute barren nothingness. None of them ever broke. They deliberately trained themselves to look directly into the terrifying eyes of utter chaos without ever blinking or stepping backward. They processed their immense personal pain entirely in private. Meanwhile, they publicly maintained the terrifyingly calm composure of a sovereign ruler who already knows exactly how the bloody war ends. You must ruthlessly forge this exact same immovable mind. Sit inside the burning fire. Choose a cold, highly calculated response over a frantic, deeply emotional reaction. Every single time you are viciously provoked by a lesser individual, people instantly stopped targeting you. They stop the exact second they fully realize that they absolutely cannot force you to break character and surrender your dominant frame. Become an impenetrable psychological fortress. You stand perfectly still inside the swirling eye of a massive, deeply destructive hurricane that totally obliterates everyone else desperately scrambling around you. The man who possesses absolute, unwavering control over his internal psychological state violently commands the entire physical world currently operating around him. Drop this affirmation in the comments. I am utterly unshakable. The fifth brutal truth. Unrestricted generosity is a catastrophic strategic flaw. You operate under a desperately flawed assumption. Wrongly believe that constantly pouring your highly valuable resources into other people will magically command their deep respect. The weak give blindly. The dangerous give strategically. Have been operating like common tap water for your entire adult life. You flow freely toward absolutely anyone who selfishly holds out their dirty hands. Water is essential for human survival, yet nobody hoards it deeply in heavy iron vaults. You are deeply confused about why nobody treats you like precious gold. The brutal reality is that completely unrestricted giving sharply communicates a devastating lack of personal standards. Machiavelli diagnosed this massive psychological failure with the icy precision of a battlefield surgeon. He explicitly stated that the ruler who mindlessly gives everything away will eventually exhaust his finite resources and become intensely hated by his own dependent people. Scarcity generates intense human desire. It is a fundamental law of brutal evolutionary psychology. You must radically restrict access. When you suddenly force people to aggressively earn your precious time and your focused attention, the entire social hierarchy violently recalibrates. You are no longer the exhausted peasant endlessly offering up the fruits of your brutal labor. You immediately become the sovereign king, tightly holding the heavy keys to the massive royal vault. People desperately want what they absolutely cannot easily obtain. Stop showing up to every single pointless argument you are casually invited to. Guard your finite, immensely valuable energy with the quiet ferocity of a dominant alpha predator. The people around you will be brutally forced into a profound psychological reckoning. They will clearly realize they can no longer lazily consume your energy without offering serious tribute. Drop this affirmation in the comments. My access is heavily restricted. The sixth brutal truth: the unseen currents dictate absolute control. Every single social interaction is a covert psychological war. Most men walk completely blind. They blindly stumble through high-stakes social interactions, while naively taking every single spoken word at exact face value. You were taught to trust the smiling faces actively performing in front of you. Here is the terrifying reality of human group dynamics. Beneath the calm surface of absolutely every single conversation runs a violent electric current of raw dominance. The naive man is a helpless pawn. The sovereign man is the grandmaster moving the heavy pieces. Picture a crowded boardroom where everyone is smiling brightly and speaking incredibly softly. The dangerous man enters the room entirely as a cold, calculating observer, before he ever becomes an active participant. He studies the invisible architecture. He relentlessly notes exactly who commands total attention, without ever actually demanding it. He spots the weakest player who constantly laughs way too loudly at the boss and his mediocre jokes. Every single tiny behavioral pattern is a highly critical data point. Machiavelli bluntly warned that men naturally deceive themselves so deeply with comfortable flattery that it becomes a devastating plague. The individual grinning at you the hardest is almost always the predator studying your exact weaknesses the most carefully. You must violently rip away the cheap illusions. Watch how the people around you subtly behave when they firmly believe that absolutely nobody important is watching them. Watch how they brutally dismiss the people they arrogantly perceive as sitting permanently beneath them. Do not ever expose your brilliant strategic insights to the vulnerable crowd. Quietly catalog every single piece of devastating psychological leverage inside your unreadable mind. You subtly adjust your physical positioning to completely dominate the hidden hierarchy without firing a single shot. The smartest man quietly takes everything he wants while making the oblivious room think it was their own brilliant idea. The seventh brutal truth: blind loyalty is a comfortable, deadly lie. Unconditional loyalty is an absolute childish myth. You invested everything you had into people, fiercely believed that the powerful bonds forged through mutual sacrifice would somehow become permanently unbreakable. The weak demand loyalty, the dangerous command leverage. Then the brutal day finally arrived. Someone you would have happily bled for coldly chose their own immediate comfort over your deep, historic connection. That sudden betrayal completely shattered your fragile understanding of how this brutal world actually operates. You fundamentally misunderstood the core mechanics of raw human survival. Human beings are rarely blindly loyal to other specific human beings. They are relentlessly loyal to their own personal advancement and their own biological survival. Machiavelli mapped this exact darkness centuries ago. He coldly observed that treacherous men will instantly turn against you the exact second that standing by your side becomes a massive liability. The wise man never builds his towering empire on the incredibly shifting sand of human gratitude. He builds it on solid rock. He constructs heavy systems of undeniable leverage that make crossing him far too painful to ever actually consider. You must stop distributing your profound trust as if it were cheap, endlessly renewable currency. Treat it like a finite commodity that requires rigorous, bloody testing before it is ever dispensed. Let people eagerly perform their cheap verbal declarations of endless loyalty. Watch their actual panicked behavior when true, terrifying pressure violently squeezes the room. Only the truly tested survive. Take the massive pain of past brutal betrayals and forge it into cold steel. The most dangerous men in history are not the lucky ones who somehow entirely avoided deep, traumatic pain. They are the ruthless ones who weaponize their own bleeding wounds to build something permanently indestructible. Drop this affirmation in the comments. I trust proven leverage. The eighth brutal truth. The violent resistance to your new evolution. You hold a dangerous blueprint, but merely consuming this deep psychological philosophy without actively weaponizing it is a completely useless intellectual exercise. The weak passively consume, the dangerous actively implement. Your transformation will be incredibly uncomfortable. It will not be loudly celebrated by the desperate parasites currently clinging to your exhausted energy. They will aggressively resist. The exact moment you start ruthlessly enforcing your iron boundaries, the surrounding crowd will inevitably panic. They will call you cold. They will publicly label you as dangerously arrogant and loudly complain that you have fundamentally changed. Let them desperately talk. Their rising frantic discomfort is your absolute ultimate compass. The people who aggressively benefited the absolute most from your former weakness will naturally scream the absolute loudest when you cut their supply. This screaming is not a tragedy. It is the highest possible confirmation that your new psychological armor is actively repelling the advancing enemy. Machiavelli understood this brutal reality. He explicitly noted that the sovereign prince must possess the dark, unwavering capacity to do wrong when it is absolutely necessary to survive. You must stop bleeding for them. You must violently stop absorbing the heavy costs of other people's chaotic, completely unpredictable, and entirely avoidable failures. You are not their permanent savior. You are absolutely not obligated to permanently carry a crushing, deeply unfair burden that was never actually yours to bear. Audit your current reality. Ruthlessly identify every single toxic relationship and pathetic internal narrative that deeply anchors you to a much lesser version of yourself. Eliminate the diseased tissue. Cut it out with the cold, absolute precision of a master surgeon who feels absolutely zero empathy for the infected flesh he actively removes. His loyalty is to the organism. His only true, unwavering loyalty is directly to the overall survival and maximum health of the sovereign, untouchable organism he is actively protecting. Rebuild your entire identity now. Must deeply invest in your dark, calculating mind with the kind of obsessive, unrelenting consistency that makes absolute mediocrity physically impossible. You are forging a masterpiece. Become so fiercely disciplined and highly strategic that the pathetic, bleeding man you were yesterday would not even recognize the apex predator you are today. The shift happens in total darkness. The true transformation begins deep in the private shadows, long before it ever publicly manifests in the brutal, heavily contested social arena. You stop negotiating with your weakness. Aggressively, violently shut down the internal voices, constantly begging you to slowly return to the incredibly comfortable safety of being universally liked. Drop this affirmation in the comments. I actively welcome the resistance. The ninth brutal truth. The permanent eradication of the nice guy. This is the exact threshold. This is exactly where your old, pathetic reality permanently ends, and your new, heavily fortified sovereign existence violently begins. Everything you learned today is totally meaningless unless you make a ruthless, irrevocable decision right here and right now. Do not wait until tomorrow. The hostile world will never magically stop aggressively testing your heavy, fortified walls for hidden structural weaknesses. The parasites will relentlessly attack. They will constantly try to heavily extract your finite resources and aggressively diminish your towering, totally untouchable physical presence every single day. That fundamental reality will never change. What must absolutely change is you. Must permanently alter your fundamental baseline standard for absolutely every single human engagement you ever dare to enter. You just survived a massive fire. Started this brutal video as a completely bleeding target endlessly desperate for the fleeting validation of completely irrelevant, highly manipulative strangers, are leaving this fierce battlefield as a heavily armored sovereign entity who strictly dictates the absolute terms of his own powerful reality. Your new standards are completely ironclad. Your heavy, calculating, deliberate silence is utterly unshakable and totally terrifying to the incredibly weak individuals desperately trying to completely decipher your hidden motives. Fiercely refuse the victim role. You violently refuse to ever again act as an open emotional landfill for the dangerously weak and the deeply, inherently ungrateful masses. Machiavelli handed you a terrifying mirror. The weak men quickly look away because the dark reflection of their own pathetic vulnerability is far too agonizing to actually process or successfully repair. Stare directly into the dark glass. Weaponize the chilling reflection to ruthlessly destroy the absolute final traces of the overly agreeable coward currently living inside your fragile, untrained mind. The coldest men dominate the board. The nicest men rot quietly in the forgotten, muddy trenches, while stupidly wondering why absolutely nobody ever returned their supposed, highly conditional loyalty. You have finally heard the truth. The universe aggressively rewards strict emotional control and severely punishes blind, completely unrestricted warmth with absolute, devastating, and entirely permanent destruction. Drop this affirmation in the comments. I choose cold over ruin. If this cuts straight to your core, hit the like button and immediately subscribe to Machiavellian Mind with notifications permanently on. This channel is an elite armory. It is heavily stocked for the coming psychological wars you are entirely guaranteed to violently fight in the extremely near, completely unavoidable future. Your dark evolution does not stop. It violently, irrevocably, and absolutely permanently begins exactly in this precise, highly calculated moment of complete psychological clarity. The unreadable man has finally arrived.